If you're looking to buy a new MacBook, it seems like it's more confusing than ever. With so many different models and so many chipsets and different configurations, it can be a bit of a challenge, especially for newcomers in choosing their perfect MacBook that's going to be right for them. Well, don't worry guys, this is my official late 2022 buyer's guide. Now, what you have to keep in mind is right off the bat, if you're looking to get a Pro model, that is the 14-inch or 16-inch, you may want to hold off for just a couple months, as typically Apple does hold yearly, sometimes bi-yearly MacBook events later in October, which is just a month from the recording of this video. But for the time being, we're gonna go over the current lineup, starting with the M1 Air going all the way to the M1 Max MacBook Pro 16-inch. So without further ado, let's get started first on pricing. Now, it's no surprise to anyone, it's no secret that MacBooks are not cheap by any means. At the bare minimum, you're gonna dish out probably around 10 Benjamins on the lower end for the M1 Air, and you can definitely configure your MacBook Pro 16-inch to reach almost $5,000 territory. So it's a really wise thing to do your research and make sure you get the computer that fits your needs. So starting off is the M1 MacBook Air that was released in 2020 and is still available on Apple's lineup, and it comes in at $1,000. That's $999. But if you follow my links that are in the video description, as of the recording of this video, there are some really sweet deals over on Amazon.com. So make sure to check out my affiliate links so you can save a ton of cash. Currently, the M1 Air can be found on Amazon for as low as $929, almost shaving off $100 off of the retail price. Then, following that, the newly redesigned M2 Air has a starting price of $1199 for the base configuration, but you can save $100 on Amazon, which is always really nice to save some additional money. Then there's the M2 MacBook Pro. This is the unicorn of the entire MacBook lineup, and I'll brush up on it a little later. It's just a weird position in where it is in the MacBook lineup. It's the only one left that has a touch bar, has the older design language that the M1 Air follows, and starts at $1299. Now, you can find it on Amazon for 5% off, so hey, saving some money is better than nothing, I guess. Then we go to the Mac Daddies. We go to the MacBook 14-inch and 16-inch line, which both feature either your choice of the M1 Pro chip, or if you're really about it, you can configure these computers to have the beefy M1 Max chip. So the base model for the 14-inch MacBook Pro with that notch and really nice redesign starts at $1999. No, I'm not talking about $19.99. I'm talking nearly $2,000 once you account for taxes. However, there is an awesome deal going on right now on Amazon.com. You can get it for 20% off. You heard me right, 20% off for a brand new 14-inch MacBook Pro. Definitely check that out using my affiliate link, as you can get it for as low as $15.99. Not bad. And finally, the big boy, the 16-inch MacBook Pro. The one with the largest display currently on Apple's lineup starts at $24.99, but is now roughly about 16% off if you use one of my links, so you can snag it for as low as $20.99. So once again, not cheap by any means. Now let's do our due diligence and look a little deeper at all the different features and specifications of each device so that you're more than well informed to make the correct purchase. Now, if we look at the design and portability of the entire MacBook line, it's really clear that the newly redesigned M2 MacBook Air is the smallest and has the best form factor, especially if you travel a lot or are a student. It's really lightweight in comparison to the gargantuan 16-inch MacBook Pro, but that's the thing, you have your trade-offs. If you do want the larger screen, it is gonna be a little bit heavier, but you get all those really nice Pro features, including that massive 16-inch display, better cameras, and much better performance. The M1 MacBook Air is also in line with the M2. You really can't go wrong on either, but if you want the absolute lightest, you're really gonna wanna go for the M2 Air. Now, speaking of, I know there's a lot of students out there who adore and love MacBook Airs. It's one of the more popular models within Apple's lineup, but you have to be very careful when you're configuring your M2 Air. And that's because I made a few videos a couple weeks ago comparing the M1 Air versus the M2 Air head to head, and it seems that there's a bit of controversy surrounding the base model of the M2 Air. Buyers beware, you will get a starting storage of 256 gigabytes for that M2 Air base model. However, the SSD performance is extremely sluggish even when you compare it versus the M1 Air. And that's because the M2 Air's SSD is separated into two different chips rather than just one. So what this is going to do is it's going to make transfer speeds a lot lower even in comparison to the prior M1 model. If you want your SSD to be combined on one singular chip, you're going to be forced to upgrade to the 512GB storage model on the M2 at a minimum, so do keep that in mind. And so of course, the number one thing that you're going to be using while on these MacBooks is of course going to be the keyboard, and thankfully all of them feature the same scissor style key mechanism that we have grown to love from Apple. They're very responsive, the keys are really bouncy, and of course the trackpad is the best in the industry, definitely being better than a lot of the Windows competition, IMO. The good thing is, if you do decide to upgrade to the bigger models, the bigger your model, in other words the 14-inch and the 16-inch, you're going to expect a much larger trackpad, and that's going to help a lot during productivity tasks like while editing on Photoshop or editing videos on Final Cut Pro. All of them are going to feature Touch ID, so that's really nifty when you just want to log into your machine very quickly. However, like I mentioned, the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro is the only one left with the touch bar. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, I think it is a huge gimmick. I never really use it almost ever. That's just my opinion. I know that there's a lot of people who do really dig the touch bar, so if you truly want a touch bar model, then your only choice is to go for the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, which, like I mentioned, has an older design, and the M2 newly redesigned Air follows the same design language as the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro, ditching that wedge shape of the M1 Air. Apple is known for having spectacular speaker quality, and on the M2 Air it has a new 4-speaker system, but to be honest, it's really not all that much better. If you truly want the best speakers that you can find on a MacBook, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is going to be your guy. The bass is much richer, it's a lot fuller, and it's going to be the one with the most volume. So consuming content, watching movies on the 16-inch MacBook Pro feels really immersive, but you really can't go wrong. Just do keep in mind that the M1 Air and the M2 Air speaker systems don't get as loud and aren't as rich and full as the Pro models. Now, looking at our displays, all of our displays feature Retina technology and is really, really nice to look at. However, the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros are going to feature mini LED versus the traditional LCD technology, and what that's going to allow is it's going to allow for local dimming zones, which means that blacks become a lot fuller and actually look like it's black rather than having the backlight turned on in the background, and you can really tell the difference right here. As you can see, the M2, following the design language of the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, now features the notch, which does translate in a better webcam. So on the M2 Air and on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, in other words the ones with the notch, they're going to feature a more improved 1080p FaceTime camera versus the 720p potato-like camera found on the MacBook Air M1 and the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. So if you do a lot of web calling, if you're on Zoom a lot, or just FaceTiming a significant other, family, or friend, then not only is the camera quality a lot better, but the mic quality is also more improved on the Pro line models. And while still on the topic of the displays, in terms of brightness, the M1 Air is going to be the lower of all of them, only having a max brightness of 400 nits. It may not sound like a lot, but it's enough for a lot of indoor scenarios. However, you're going to start to notice some trouble once you start going outdoors. 400 nits really doesn't cut it, especially when you have a really, really strong glare. Thankfully, the M2 Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro have up to 500 nits of peak brightness, which is a lot better. That's an increase of about 20%. So the 14-inch and 16-inch Pro models have a little twist to them, right? So typically, if you're just web surfing, your peak brightness is also going to be at 500 nits. However, this changes a lot whenever you start consuming HDR content, as you can have up to a maximum sustained peak brightness of 1000 nits and maxes out at up to 1600 nits of brightness when editing or consuming HDR content, and that's just extremely bright. It almost rivals their Pro Display XDR, and this is really, really nice when you're outdoors. Everything is so vivid, and it's especially important for photographers who want to edit their photos on the fly, for videographers creating a video from scratch, and stuff of the like. And so if you want the best, most richest display, definitely pick up the 14-inch or 16-inch model, as that mini LED is a game changer. There's a really stark difference between that and some of the other models, as the mini LED technology, like I mentioned, has those local dimming zones that allows for really, really clear and concise colors and richer black, since that backlight is dimmed or completely turned off depending on what you're watching. Oh, and I did forget to mention that on the 14-inch and 16-inch model, you do have Pro Motion. It's that really smooth and fluid display technology that is also featured on the iPhone 13 Pro line. This is going to allow your MacBook to have a max refresh rate of up to 100 120 Hz versus the other ones, including the M1 Air, the M2 Air, and the M2 MacBook Pro, which are only stuck at 60 Hz. Like I always tell all of my friends, once you go to 120 Hz, it's really hard to go back. It's just really fluid and it looks really nice. And now talking about ports, and there's a lot going on here. So for the best productivity workflows, definitely you're gonna wanna aim for the 14-inch or 16-inch MacBook Pros. Those are gonna offer the most versatility as you feature 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports and MagSafe 3. Additionally, on the right hand side, you're gonna have an SDXC card slot, which is really nice. That now means that you no longer have to buy a stupid adapter or dongle, and you also have a 3.5mm headphone jack that supports high impedance headphones. So this is great for those who produce music content or who are DJs. And there is also an HDMI port found on the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros for external display support. The 14-inch and 16-inch, I believe, support up to 3 different monitors, whereas all the other ones, the lower end models, only have support for 1 external display. So I myself don't really have a lot of external display support. I have no need for it, but if that is important to you, then the 14-inch and 16-inch are gonna be your go-tos. The M2 Air, thankfully, does have MagSafe 3. So in theory, this does also free up a USB-C port so that you can do other things, attach a dongle, maybe attach an external hard drive, whatever it is freed up because now you don't have to use one of the ports, one of the USB-C ports that is, to charge. You can instead just charge with MagSafe, and if you happen to trip over the cable, then it's magnetic, so your MacBook won't come crashing down. And by the way, the headphone port on the M2 Air also supports high impedance headphones, so that's really nice. With the M1 Air and the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, you're a lot more limited on your ports. You're only gonna feature a 3.5mm headphone jack on the right of both, and on the left-hand side, you're only gonna have 2 USB-C ports that are not the faster Thunderbolt 4 ports that are found on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. All right, now getting on to battery life, but before that, I would recommend, if you're interested in a battery drain test of the M1 and the M2 Air head-to-head, definitely click the card at the top right or click the video link in the video description. But with the M1 and the M2 Air, Apple gives you a promised 15 hours of web surfing while on those machines. The M2 MacBook Pro on paper has the best battery life as Apple promises up to 17 hours of wireless web surfing. And unfortunately, this comes as a surprise to many, the 14-inch and 16-inch Pro have on paper the worst battery, with the 14-inch promising up to 11 hours of web surfing and the 16-inch up to 14 hours of web surfing. And this is for a variety of reasons. Specifically with that mini LED technology, you have a ton more pixels to pump out, and not only that, you do have larger displays, which of course consumes more battery. Soon, I'm gonna have a battery drain test of the entire MacBook lineup. So if you wanna see that battery drain test, definitely drop it in the comment section below. It's definitely in my queue of videos to produce. Don't worry, there's just a lot of stuff that's coming out and I have to get to before that. And now we go over to the topic of RAM, or as some call it, system memory. So before I start saying anything about RAM is very user specific. Where one user might be okay with just 8 GB of unified memory, some might need upwards of 24 gigs, or some really could use 64 GB as the M1 Max can max out to 64 GB of unified memory. It's a ton of RAM, so if you guys have any questions on your configurations, definitely follow me on my socials. Hit me up with a DM and let me know your specific use case, and I'll try to get to you as quickly as I can because I know a lot of you guys have a ton of questions as to which configuration you might need. What I will say is that about 90% of people are gonna be okay with 8 GB of unified memory. For those that do have productivity tasks either as a hobby or as their job, you might wanna consider 16 GB or 24 GB at the bare minimum because you'll be using a lot of multitasking applications. It's not uncommon for me to have Adobe Lightroom up, Final Cut Pro, and Logic Pro while also surfing the internet at the same time. And when you're using a model with 8 GB, sometimes you can start to see some lag, especially when rendering or especially when exporting. So anyway, the M1 Air has a starting base configuration of 8 GB of unified memory and can be configured all the way up to 16 GB. The M2 Air and also the M2 MacBook Pro have the same option, but they add a third one, having the capability to be configured all the way up to 24 GB of unified memory. And of course, when you're dishing out that much money on a 14-inch or 16-inch model, it's only right to increase the base starting RAM. And we do get that. On the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, they start with 16 GB of unified memory and can be configured all the way up to 64 gigs. But there is a small stipulation to that. if you do want 64 gigabytes of unified memory on your MacBook Pros, you're gonna be forced to upgrade to the M1 Max chip. And at that point, you're really starting to dish out some serious cash for these machines. So make sure you make the correct decision. And if you do have any questions, like I said, shoot me over a DM either on TikTok, shoot me a tweet over on Twitter, or follow me on Instagram to also send me a private message. And in terms of performance, with some general Geekbench tests, as you can see, obviously, the M1 Max, the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and 14-inch are expected to perform way better, especially when we consider multi-core applications. Now, I know that it can get very confusing with the CPU and different cores. You know, the M1 Air starts with 7 cores, the M2 starts with 8. The graphical cores can go all the way up to 32 cores on the M1 Max, so I know it can get a little confusing. But I do have some charts here to spit out some generic information that you might find helpful. So as you can see, over on single core, the M2 chip does fare better than any of the M1 models. And of course, from one generation to the next, that's what you expect, especially considering that the M1 and the M2 are very similar in terms of single core performance. But of course, the M1 Pro and M1 Max start to outshine even the M2 once we start talking about multi-core applications, like I mentioned, with much higher multi-core performance scores. And the same is true over on graphical performance. So if we run Geekbench's metal test, as you can see, the M1 Air starts with a base 7-core GPU, whereas the M2 starts at an 8-core GPU. And like I mentioned, there's so many different options going all the way up to 32 cores for the M1 Max. And as you can see, if you do opt for that model, man, you're getting significant graphical performance gains over just the starting base M1. So if you're using your machine for your job or for your sole income generator, then of course time is money. So investing in much higher graphical cores or a better CPU translates to more money, as you're able to render and export videos and photos at a much faster rate. And like I said, time is money for a lot of us. So if you do need that extra performance, then I would definitely recommend either the M1 Pro or the M1 Max. And so now to finally round us out, here's my buyer's guide segment of this video, where I tell you who I think each MacBook is for, starting with the M1 Air. To be completely honest, I think this computer is going to be the best one for about 70 to 80% of consumers. It's great for those barely starting out into Apple's Mac ecosystem and who may be purchasing their first ever MacBook. The M1 is perfect. It's extremely snappy and it is no slouch whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it's still leagues ahead of some of the competition. It is also going to equate to the cheapest model that you can find. So of course, for a lot of students, this is going to be extremely imperative, as not many students have a really high budget to spend like some professionals do on a $3,000 or $4,000 computer. So for that reason, I think the M1 Air is great for casuals. It's great giving it for a gift for someone who's not as heavily invested into technology or someone who doesn't have a big workflow. So if you're just going to do your typical web browsing, maybe a Word document here and there, and maybe a project over on Keynote or PowerPoint, then the M1 Air is going to be the one for you. The M2 Air is going to be for those who want that fresh redesign and who could utilize that extra port and use it to their advantage, because remember, you do feature MagSafe 3. So instead of charging it with the USB-C port on like one of the ones on the M1 Air, you have one freed up. So you have a little bit more extra versatility in terms of your peripherals. And not only that, you have a better webcam, you have the fresh new design, you have 100 nits of extra peak brightness, which is really, really nice. And of course, you can't go wrong with that new Starlight and Midnight color. I mean, man, they look really, really good. The problem that I mentioned though is that base SSD storage that is divided between two chips rather than being found on one. So your transfer speeds are going to be significantly slower than on the M1 Air, so do be careful. The problem here is if you decide to upgrade to the 512 gigabyte model, you're already dishing out close to as much money as you would by buying a 14-inch MacBook Pro using one of my links below. So it starts to get a little confusing at that point. The M2 MacBook Pro 13-inch is an enigma for me. I really don't understand why it's still in the lineup. It's really weird. It does start at $1,300, but one of the big perks that it has over the M2 and even the M1 Air is that it does have a fan. The M2 Air and M1 Air have a fanless design. So for extended and longer productivity workflows, the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro could prove to be useful for those professionals who do need a lot of time to finish a project, as the fan will cool down those internals and allow your system to not thermal throttle, therefore giving you peak performance for much longer. Now, of course, another reason you might get it is if for some reason you just really dig the touch bar. Hey man, look, there's no hate if you do. Once again, I find it kind of useless. It's kind of cool when you're sending emojis, but that's about it. So that's the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro. Now, for those really serious about their productivity, obviously the 14-inch and 16-inch with that awesome and gorgeous mini LED technology is going to be the best bet. Not only do you get more screen real estate, but you do also get the option of the M1 Pro or the M1 Ultra if you truly do need that extra performance. Now, I'll be the first one to say, the M1 Ultra is gonna be an extreme overkill if you truly do not need all that horsepower. The M1 Pro model on the 14-inch is already gonna handle almost everything you throw at it as if it's nothing. It's a walk in the park for the 14-inch base model. That M1 Pro is a very powerful chip, but if you do happen to do 3D rendering, or if you happen to have multiple multi-core applications open at the same time, then the M1 Ultra could prove useful. Now, for most, I would say stick with the M1 Pro unless you do fall in that category I mentioned earlier. But if you do need the larger screen real estate, it's really, really nice on that massive display on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Not only that, you do get a much larger trackpad, and overall, it's the best to consume content since the blacks are really, really rich and there's a lot of screen real estate. The much larger display is awesome to have different apps open at the same time, and it's just a really, really nice and big display. However, do keep in mind it's really heavy and lunky, so if you ever are in a place, maybe like a train or an airplane, that really, really big 16-inch is gonna feel a bit cumbersome, and it is big, trust me, but if you do need that extra screen real estate, then there's no questions asked, right? So there you have it, guys. That's my buyer's guide for the MacBook lineup as of September of 2022. Now, an October event isn't always promised, so like I mentioned, if you're interested in a 14-inch or 16-inch, at the bare minimum, wait to see if there's an Apple event in October. If not, then go ahead and buy to your heart's content. But for the time being, the M2 Air is my favorite. It's my top pick as it's really versatile. It has a sleek and new modern design with sick color options. It has a better webcam. The notch might be a little annoying to some, but trust me, it's very speedy, and the M2 chip will handle just about everything you throw at it. Just do keep in mind about that starting SSD storage. Once again, as a reminder, if you want to save a ton of cash on your MacBook purchase, click my affiliate links down below. And of course, as always, drop any video suggestions that you may have in the comment section below. Who knows, I might choose your video suggestion and upload that video and give you a shout out. So guys, for now, that's been it for me. Follow me over on my socials. Let me know if you need some help buying a MacBook. And with that being said, I'm clocking out for now, but I can't wait to catch you all in the next one.